Hey everyone, welcome to Seeking History. Did you know that before we had this massive network of paved roads, America's rivers were often the best way, really the most efficient and affordable way to travel and ship goods long distances?
Absolutely. You can almost picture the Mississippi River as like the main interstate highway of its time, just teeming with activity.
It's a really powerful image, and that's exactly what we're exploring today. The incredibly rich and complex history of river transportation right here in the United States, and crucially, why it still matters so much.
Yeah, we're going way beyond just talking about boats. We want to get into how these waterways really shaped everything, our economy, our society, our culture, even, well, everything over hundreds of years.
For sure.
Yeah.
We'll be tracing this journey from, say, the ingenious dugout canoes used by indigenous peoples, all the way up to the massive modern barge tows you might see today.
And we'll touch on all sorts of angles, the history, obviously, but also the societal changes, the economic impact, the businesses that grew up around the rivers, and even some incredible engineering.
Sounds great. So let's start way back, before Europeans even arrived. Rivers weren't just scenery. They were absolutely essential lifelines.
That's exactly right. Indigenous peoples were incredibly skilled navigators. They developed amazing watercraft dugout canoes, sometimes carved from enormous single logs, and these light, agile birchbark canoes.
And they used these to build really complex networks, didn't they? For trade, travel.
Oh, absolutely. Extensive networks. Think about the Mississippian cultures. They had trade routes stretching hundreds, maybe thousands of miles. They were moving goods like copper from the Great Lakes area, beautiful shells from the Gulf Coast, agricultural products, all facilitated by these river highways.
Wow. And then when European explorers started arriving, they immediately saw the value of these rivers for getting inland, right?
They did. Rivers were the natural entry points into the continent. You had explorers like De Soto using the Mississippi to venture deep into the interior. French trappers relied heavily on the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes system to reach those rich fur-bearing regions.
Yeah, the fur trade was such a huge driver in those early colonial days. Rivers like the Hudson, the Delaware,
Yeah.
they became these vital conduits for getting valuable furs back to Europe.
And the location of settlements often depended entirely on river access. Look at New Orleans, right at the mouth of the Mississippi. It was the perfect spot, a natural hub connecting the vast interior with the Gulf and the wider world.
So as settlers pushed west, they also leaned heavily on the rivers. But their boats were maybe a bit different.
Yeah, often less sophisticated, especially initially. You saw the rise of the flatboat, basically large, simple rafts designed to float cargo downstream. The catch was they were usually a one-way trip.
One way. What happened then?
They'd often just dismantle the boat at the destination and sell the lumber. Going upstream was a whole different story.
Yeah.
That required keelboats, which were incredibly labor-intensive.
How so?
Well, crews had to pull them against the current, row, or sometimes even get out and walk along the banks, literally pulling the boat with ropes. It was just back-breaking work.
It's genuinely hard to picture that kind of effort today. But then came a major, major shift, the steamboat.
Ah, yes, the game changer. 1807, Robert Fulton's Clermont makes its successful trip up the Hudson River. That was a moment.
Why was that so significant?
Because suddenly, reliable upstream travel was possible. Relatively fast, too, compared to keelboats. It just cracked open the interior of the continent in a way nothing else could have.
Right. So the Mississippi, the Ohio, they weren't just one-way streets anymore.
Exactly. They transformed into these bustling two-way commercial highways. It's amazing to think by the 1860s there were over 1,000 steamboats operating on the western rivers alone. Travel time plummeted, shipping costs dropped.
And the economic ripple effects must have been enormous.
Oh, huge. Steamboats were critical to the expansion of the cotton kingdom in the South, getting that valuable crop to market efficiently. And they massively accelerated westward settlement, moving people, supplies, everything needed to build new farms and towns. The speed just changed the economics of agriculture entirely.
But they weren't just about cargo, were they? These boats sound like little floating worlds.
They really were. Fascinating social environments. You had clear class distinctions, luxurious cabins for the wealthy, much more basic conditions for others, definite social hierarchies on board.
And specific social customs, too, like separate areas for men and women.
Often, yes. And the crews themselves were incredibly diverse. A large number of African Americans, both enslaved and free, worked in absolutely vital roles. Firemen sweating down in the engine rooms, highly skilled pilots who knew the rivers intimately, deckhands, cooks, even entertainers.
That's a really important point about the workforce, and that continued after emancipation too, didn't it?
Yeah.
Black mariners remained crucial.
Absolutely. And we can't forget the cultural side. Those black riverboat musicians in the late 19th, early 20th century, they were instrumental in carrying New Orleans jazz up the Mississippi, seeding it in places like Memphis, St. Louis. The Steamboat was a cultural artery, too.
Wow. Mobile cultural hubs carrying music along with cotton. But it wasn't all romantic, was it? There was a dark side.
Definitely. Steamboat travel was incredibly dangerous. Boiler explosions were terrifyingly common. Sometimes lacked safety, sometimes just the immense pressures involved.
Any major examples come to mind?
The Sultana disaster in 1865 is probably the most infamous. An overcrowded boat, mostly carrying Union soldiers returning home after the Civil War. The boilers exploded near Memphis. The death toll is estimated around 1,700 people, just horrific.
Goodness. That really drives home the risks. Fires were also a constant threat, snags in the river.
It really underscores the human cost that came with this technological leap forward. And as the nation kept expanding west in the mid-1800s, rivers remained vital, not just for commerce, but for moving people and supplying new industries, farming, mining, logging.
And then, of course, came the Civil War. Rivers suddenly took on huge strategic importance.
Immense strategic importance, especially the Mississippi. The Union's whole Anaconda Plan was built around controlling the Mississippi River.
Right. The idea was to split the Confederacy in two.
Exactly. Cut off their major transportation and supply route, essentially strangling their ability to fight effectively. The rivers became battlegrounds.
So we had actual naval battles on rivers.
We did. Ironclad gunboats became key weapons. Think about major campaigns like the Siege of Vicksburg or the fall of Memphis. Controlling the river was absolutely essential to those Union victories. Moving troops, supplies, river control was a massive factor.
But even with all that importance, the steamboat's dominance didn't last forever, did it?
No, it didn't. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a new rival emerged, the railroads.
Ah, the iron horse. What advantages did trains have?
Several key ones. Railroads were generally faster, they weren't limited by river levels or ice in the winter, and crucially, they could reach far more places, connecting inland communities that rivers just couldn't access. Steamboats faced some serious competition.
So did river transport just fade away?
Not entirely. It adapted. It shifted focus to what it still did incredibly well, moving huge volumes of bulk cargo, things that weren't necessarily time-sensitive over long distances, very cheaply.
Okay, so this is where we start seeing the shift towards the modern system.
Exactly. This is the era where powerful diesel towboats start appearing. These aren't pulling boats anymore. They're pushing massive groups of barges lashed together. We call them tows, even though they're pushing.
And one of those tows can move an incredible amount of stuff, right?
Oh, absolutely. A single standard 15-barge tow can carry the equivalent of something like 200 rail cars or over 1,000 large trucks. The efficiency for bulk freight is just phenomenal.
And what kind of freight are we talking about?
Think essential commodities. Grain pouring out of the Midwest farms, coal from Appalachia heading to power plants, steel for industry, chemicals, petroleum products, things that are fundamental to our economy.
So chances are, things we use every single day might have spent part of their journey on a barge.
Very likely, yes. Raw materials, fuels. It's a part of the supply chain that's often invisible to the end consumer, but it's absolutely vital.
And making all this possible required some serious work on the rivers themselves.
Huge amounts of work. And that's where the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers comes in. They've played this enormous, often quiet role in developing and maintaining our inland waterway system for well over a century.
What kind of work do they do?
A lot. Dredging channels to keep them deep enough for the big tows, building and operating this incredibly complex system of locks and dams.
Locks and dams. How do those work exactly? I picture them like elevators for boats.
That's a perfect analogy. They really are water elevators. If a river has a significant change in elevation, like from a dam, a boat enters a lock chamber. Gates close behind it. Then the water level inside the chamber is either raised or lowered to match the level on the other side of the dam. Gates open, boat moves on.
Ingenious. Allows navigation over much longer stretches of river.
Precisely. Plus, the Corps handles channel maintenance, marking safe routes with buoys, removing obstructions. It's a massive ongoing effort. Think about huge projects like the lock system on the upper Mississippi or the Tennessee-Tombigbee waterway that connected two major river systems. These are monumental engineering feats.
And the economic payoff from this maintained system is pretty significant.
Immense. We're talking hundreds of thousands of jobs supported directly and indirectly. It's crucial for moving goods domestically, but also for international trade. A huge percentage of U.S. grain exports, for example, move down the Mississippi to ports like New Orleans. Same for petroleum products, coal.
And the industry itself has kept up with technology.
Oh, absolutely. Modern towboats are incredibly sophisticated. GPS navigation, advanced radar, complex communication systems, they operate 24/7 in all sorts of conditions. And the barges themselves are often specialized covered barges for grain, tank barges for liquids, open hoppers for coal or rock.
You mentioned efficiency earlier. How does barge transport stack up against, say, trucks or trains environmentally?
Generally, it's quite favorable for bulk goods. On a ton-mile basis, moving 1 ton of cargo 1-mile barges burn significantly less fuel and produce fewer emissions compared to trucks and often trains, too. So for moving large quantities of heavy stuff, it's a relatively sustainable option.
And we can't forget the ports themselves. Places like New Orleans, Memphis, St. Louis.
Critical hubs. They're major intermodal centers where barge traffic connects seamlessly with rail lines and trucking networks. Goods arrive by barge, get loaded onto trains or trucks, and vice versa. They're huge economic engines for their regions.
Okay, so it's a vital system, but it must face challenges today. Nothing lasts forever without upkeep.
That's definitely true. Aging infrastructure is probably the biggest single challenge. A lot of those locks and dams we talked about were built decades ago, many during the mid-20th century or even earlier.
They were wearing out.
They are. They need major repairs, significant upgrades, sometimes complete replacement, and that requires very substantial investment. It's a constant topic of discussion and funding debates.
And what about environmental concerns? Building dams, dredging channels, that has to have an impact.
It absolutely does. While barge transport itself can be efficient, the infrastructure needed can be disruptive. Dams block fish migration, change river flows, alter sediment transport, affect floodplains. There's also always the risk of spills, whether fuel or cargo.
Are things being done to address that?
Yes, there are ongoing efforts. Things like the Mississippi River Restoration and Resilience Initiative aim to improve ecosystem health. Sometimes fish passages are added to dams, and in some cases, older, less necessary dams are actually being removed to restore river connectivity. But it's a complex balancing act.
Plus, there's still competition from rail and trucks, I assume.
Always. And then you have newer challenges, like climate change. More extreme weather events, major floods can halt navigation and damage infrastructure, while severe droughts can lower river levels so much that barges can't operate or have to carry lighter loads. We've seen both happen in recent years.
So looking ahead, what's the future hold? Is the industry adapting?
It is. They're exploring things like greater automation on vessels, better real-time tracking and logistics for more efficiency, and looking into alternative fuels like biofuels or even hydrogen to reduce the environmental footprint further.
And there's that constant tension, isn't there, between using the rivers for navigation and all the other demands, flood control, water supply, recreation, preserving the environment.
Exactly. Managing a major river system involves juggling all these competing and sometimes conflicting needs. It's an ongoing societal discussion, really.
Beyond all the economics and engineering, there's also that deep cultural connection we have to our rivers.
Oh, definitely. You can't talk about American rivers without thinking of Mark Twain and his stories of steamboat life. Or the music, those classic folk songs like Old Man River that capture the power and mood of the Mississippi.
River festivals, riverboat casinos, even today. They're still part of our cultural landscape.
They are. It's almost like river transport has become this sort of invisible infrastructure. It's so fundamental, moving so much essential stuff, but because it happens relatively quietly, often out of sight for many people, we don't always appreciate its scale or importance.
That's a great way to put it. So what's the outlook? Will rivers continue to be important?
I think so. There are initiatives like the recent Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that aim to provide funding for some of those crucial lock and dam upgrades. Combined with technological progress and a push towards sustainability, it seems clear that river transport will continue to be a really vital piece of the American economic puzzle, even if it stays somewhat hidden in plain sight.
Absolutely. When you trace it all back, from those first indigenous canoes to today's massive barge tows, river transportation has just been this foundational element in the American story.
It really has profoundly shaped our economy, our settlement patterns, our society, our culture. It's been, as you said earlier, like the bloodstream for expansion and commerce for centuries.
A forgotten bloodstream, perhaps. Enabling exploration, powering industry. It's been this silent, powerful force.
So maybe the next time you're near a major river or you see a tow moving steadily along, or even just cross a bridge over one, take a second. Think about that immense network, that deep history flowing beneath the surface.
Yeah, and consider how these waterways are still shaping the world around us, often in ways we don't even realize. It makes you wonder, what other seemingly invisible systems are quietly powering our lives every day?